Hello, everybody. Welcome to Philadelphia IGDA meeting for March 2021. Tonight, I have the pleasure of welcoming Microsoft's Kevin Appel, who currently serves as technical artist for AltSpace VR. I'm going to let Kevin introduce himself and tell us a little bit more about what he does, but first, let me introduce myself as well as the IGDA. So, for those who don't know, my name is Adrian Sandoval. I am the chair of the Philadelphia chapter for the International Game Developers Association. We are a global organization that is dedicated to the enrichment and advocacy of game developers. Here in Philadelphia, we are dedicated to supporting our fast growing professional network, as well as our very vibrant indie and academic community as well. If you would like more information on the IGDA, what it does, as well as information and benefits surrounding whether joining the organization, please head over to igda.org and consider becoming a member. As for us here in Philadelphia, we hold monthly events such as this one on the second Tuesday of every month. So please be sure to follow us on our social media channels such as Facebook or Twitter, or check out our website at philly.igda.org to keep up to date on our events as they happen. We also have a Discord channel, so please be sure to join that and join up and talk with the vibrant community here, as well as our YouTube channel where we do recordings of previous meetings, including this one in the near future. So please consider subscribing. If you ever can't make a meeting, the video will be there. One last thing. We do have a code of conduct, which you can read in full at our website. So please keep in mind that all of our events and communities are safe and inclusive spaces, and please be sure to respect each other in your communication here and our other events as well, and well as the online spaces such as the aforementioned Discord. All right, thank you all again so much, and with that, here is Kevin Appel.
Thank you, Adrian. Thanks, IGDA, for having me. Thanks, everyone, for attending and letting me speak to you through this wonderful web chat from this weird blank void that I'm in, like an off-brand John Oliver. So my name is Kevin Appel. I'm a senior tech artist at Microsoft working on AltSpace VR. I've also worked on HoloLens 1 and 2, as well as Windows Mixed Reality. In the past, I was also a production artist in Previs. I'll kind of cover a little bit more of that in the presentation today. So I want to kind of go over a little bit of my background as well as some case studies about how tech art has helped me or my teams in the past, and how some of the lessons I've learned about tech art may be applied to game development on a small team at scale. So I'm going to go ahead and share a screen real quick. Is everyone seeing this? Adrian, thumbs up, good.
Yep, I can see it.
Okay, great. So I'm terrible at titles, but the title of this talk I've called The Invisible Process, Helping Artists Focus on Art, Not Pipeline. Basically, in my career as a tech artist, the goal, and with HoloLens and some of our UI and UX design, the goal is always kind of getting people to have fun or getting people to accomplish their task. And when it comes to the teams I've worked on or the projects I've been on, getting artists and designers to just focus on what they're good at and what they care about and not process is kind of a big deal. And it really helps teams sort of accomplish more. So as I mentioned, in my career, I've kind of been a generalist and skewed more into the tech art role. I've worked at a number of studios and more in kind of different hats. I started off over 10 years ago at a studio called 321 Launch, where I was a freelance artist and art lead for about 4 years, on and off with a little bit of freelancing elsewhere here and there. And that studio did previs work for TV commercials, large brands like Coca-Cola, Budweiser, Super Bowl spots. And it was a fascinating studio because it was previs, so there's kind of a limit to how much we want to push the realism of things. But there was also a speed to it. All the work was very fast. We were very pipeline focused. And I think the kind of deal was when we started committing to a commercial, we'd have a rough cut in sort of 48 hours. And to do that, we had really talented, hardworking people, but as well as a lot of tooling. And as an artist, I was advantaged by those tools. And in my whole career ever since then, I feel like I've been kind of playing catch up to what tech artists and TDs allowed me to do then that I took for granted. After moving on from Previs, I came to Microsoft originally to do some prototyping for what I did not know was the HoloLens. It was before the product was announced. So I kind of came to Seattle originally on a contract, and that kind of turned into several months of work and then 6+ years of work. So in my time at Microsoft, I was on the team that was the original visual design team for the HoloLens. We did a lot of brand development and UX for the actual HoloLens operating system, as well as a lot of prototypes and keynotes and vision videos for what the future of computing and AR could be. I worked on HoloLens 1, HoloLens 2, and as mentioned, I'm currently on AltSpace VR, which, despite having VR in the title, is actually a cross-platform social and events app. You can be in spaces together for anything from a big concert like Burning Man last summer to a hangout with your friends to an open mic night. So it's a platform that really empowers people, especially in times like these, to kind of be there together in VR or cross-platform and actually experience things in a more human way. So to start a little bit more in my career with Launch, I was an art lead and I was a modeler as well as sometimes a rigger for anything that was outside of our kind of standard pipeline. I did anything from characters to props to environments to product. If we had kind of hero shots of like, you know, a branded bottle or like an Airwick, you know, dispenser was one of the things I remember modeling from back then. But at some point in my career there, I really got into kind of establishing new workflows and new art quality. So we got into high res to low res workflows that we weren't really doing at the time. And I sort of led the way mostly with wardrobe. I have a couple examples here on the screen of some characters that have similar garments that were done with Marvelous Designer and ZBrush. And I had some pipeline and workflow around simulating these things onto different characters and being able to sort of reproject in order to get the details back from one base mesh to another. So we had a really big asset library. We had tons of characters, and we were able to build these kind of like paper doll style wardrobe and avatar, well, not avatar, character parts in order to put these things together very quickly for all sorts of different commercials. And some of the work that we did, we'd had a lot of sports commercials. So one of the things that I kind of developed that was sort of getting my feet wet with pipeline and process a little bit was actually making our jersey numbers dynamic. I got the idea from sports games. I had kind of peeked under the hood in modding some of those growing up as a teenager. And I wanted to make it a little easier for us to make quality uniforms for our commercials without having so much hands-on work. So the way we kind of originally were working with these things is, let's say we had a football commercial or baseball, basketball, hockey, soccer. We did commercials for all these sports for different markets. And one of the things that would come up is having to populate, you know, a field or a bench or an arena of players that are all wearing different jersey numbers. And it was a lot of kind of manual asset work. You know, for this soccer example, an asset artist would have to create a jersey texture, create a texture for the shorts for these numbers, and maybe even more than one jersey texture. You know, some sports jerseys have like a big number and a small number on the shoulders. And then we would save these out to a character master file that would get updated to a scene or a shot by our animators. And then if we had a revision, what had to happen at this point is basically you're going all the way back to the asset artist. Our animator had to say, hey, I need this person to be wearing number 22. Asset artist had to go back to the jersey texture, go back to the shorts texture, reauthor those, remaster the file, re-update in the shot, get that render out, and kind of be back to square one. So from a standpoint of wanting to make our assets dynamic, and honestly, as an artist, like not wanting to spend time doing that task of just making these things over and over again and having to, you know, change. Sometimes you'd have to change jersey numbers multiple times throughout the course of a job. And it was kind of wasted work to some extent. And also hindered our quality, because if you have to manually create these textures every time, this is kind of before Substance Painter, so we didn't have the ability to make it more procedurally, you weren't going to put that much quality into it. So by making these things dynamic, what we could do is update these things just in the character master file or in the shot. So when you created a uniform in the first place, which could get pulled onto multiple characters, you would give it this capability of having these dynamic jersey numbers, sort of like in sports games. And in terms of the work, it now created, it sort of broke that dependency on going back to Photoshop and re-updating the asset. For an animator, they could either update it right there in the shot, you know, if they're pressed for time, they don't even need to request anyone do anything. They can have an override on that number, fix it in the shot if it's a background character, and then say, hey, next time you update that character, can you change this? Or if there was more time, the character artist could just update it in the master file, but you didn't have to go back to Photoshop. You didn't have to kind of go back through the whole pipeline. And so this was kind of my first experience of actually working in the pipeline. We had a really great tools team, I think 4 people on it. Most of our pipeline was pretty automated. And so when I came up with the system, and there was a lot of the runtime for us at this time, it's basically motion builder. And there was a lot of like visual script that went into making this work. And that was a lot to set up for an artist. So when I came up with the system and made a couple jerseys with it, it was basically put to me to dive in and actually write this into the pipeline with C++ and make sure that, in Maya, the artist could put these cards on the jersey with a group name, and our pipeline would automatically detect that existed and populate the character file with all the right nodes and kind of material set up to make it work. So that was kind of opened my eyes that, how we work and the process that we take as artists can be optimized. And I actually had the ability to sort of dive in and work on it. Moving on from kind of my time in previs, I joined Microsoft in late 2014. As I mentioned, it was for the HoloLens before it was really announced. I worked on both versions of the HoloLens release in the show. I worked on the Windows Mixed Reality system, which is kind of our VR version of the HoloLens experience. I also worked for a lot of our keynote demos that were done for both the HoloLens 1 and the HoloLens 2 announce. I made visuals and assets for that. And that could be anything from like helping to optimize art to making shaders to effects like the kind of ocean tiles in both of these examples. And a lot of that was kind of, pioneering new workflows with emerging technology and some proprietary engine stuff. And it's really kind of broadened my skill set from being just kind of an asset artist to getting more and more technical, working more in runtime logic, technical design, technical animation, and getting more involved in like how we as a small team, the visual design team, could work on these things efficiently. So for the HoloLens shell, it's kind of funny to talk about something like an operating system, but because it was fully 3D, we kind of had to lean on a lot of what folks on the production team and the visual design team had experienced in either VFX or games and try to make things more efficiently. So for the HoloLens, I worked with engineers to design templates for our UI and our materials. And basically, you can think of it as similar to, prefabs in Unity or blueprints in Unreal, where originally to update things like system materials or button effects and 3D UI throughout the shell, these assets all kind of lived as one-offs, and every corner of the product got exported individually. So I was responsible for the holograms app and the photos app. Another designer was mostly responsible for the Microsoft Edge kind of browser app, the actual 3D version of that you'd experience on a HoloLens. The pins panel also had some core templates. And originally, for a while, if you wanted to update the design of a button and say this has to be brighter, this animation has to change, everyone had to go make sure that they were kind of doing the custodial work of cleaning that up system-wide. And it could take days or even weeks to kind of do a whole refresh of the design language of the shell because it was a lot of manual surface to touch. So by building these UI templates, we had templates for selected button states, dark and light UI schemes. The templates were kind of parametric where designers could plug in, I want this icon and label button, I want an icon only button, I want to have control over kind of the text size of that button for different corners of the shell, or text only buttons, the different kind of justifications. And it seems like straightforward, just kind of UI work, but we approached it in a very kind of game forward manner, really trying to make things template driven, prefab derived, so that way you could update 3 or 4 files in one spot and see it propagate throughout the entire system. And it turned from days to kind of see big design overhauls to 1 or 2 artists could iterate on our system UI and materials, and you would just see it instantly. So we got to the point where close to release of the original HoloLens, I think I was sitting down and just noodling kind of on the fine details of the buttons for, a day or even 2, just trying to make sure we really had everything legible and animating well and really beautiful. Some other interesting learnings about how to drive things more parametrically came from my time with mixed reality. So when we kind of ported our design system for HoloLens to VR, we were sort of porting from one proprietary engine to another. And a lot of our shell work continued that sort of prefab driven mentality where kind of the HoloLens version design would extend into VR, and there was some parametric change that happened there. But one of the assets that was actually really interesting was the actual motion controllers for VR themselves. So I created the kind of game res model from our industrial designers, and I actually worked with our hardware driver team to come up with a scheme where the hierarchy of the FBX itself that I delivered also dictated how the controller could animate, how the thumbstick would move, how the touchpad extents would work when we were highlighting where users were touching that, how the buttons and the grip controllers would all animate. It also had attach points for things like labels and UI. And it was interesting because to update sort of the capabilities and the animations of this thing, we just had this very procedural, asset-driven way of doing it that didn't really have animation state machines that you might see in Unity and Unreal that would require, like, here's the model, let's export an animation clip for each of the buttons individually, let's build a state machine that handles all those things. It was kind of just driven by raw data. And then because it was driven so cleanly by raw data, it was really easy to attach to. So cross-platform in both Unity and in our shell, you would see these controllers animate being completely procedurally driven from the driver stack, and we would attach visuals. And in this example here, this is a prototype I did where I wanted to hack hands onto the actual controllers to see what it would feel like to kind of look down and actually see yourself holding these controllers in VR. These hands are, of course, pretty dev art. It's obviously not shipping feature, but it was a really fun experiment to see how just by making a couple hand poses that matched what the controller input was doing and hooking it up one-to-one, I was able to very quickly prototype, in under a day, what it would feel like to actually drive human hands based on the procedural animation of these controllers. And again, because it's parametric, it was really fast to update, and you could kind of tune what the controllers could do pose-wise very quickly. So moving on from kind of the AR and shell VR side, I joined AltSpace in 2019 to redesign our avatars. I am the kind of sole tech artist on the team, and so for the avatar production, I was pretty involved in driving anything tech art related to the project. These here are just some stills kind of from marketing and from our release of these new avatars to show what the product looks like and kind of where we landed. So in terms of understanding kind of the design process and how we went through AltSpace avatars, I want to start with kind of what we came from. So when we look at the last gen sort of design of our AltSpace avatars, we have on the left these humanoid avatars, which had a male and female kind of base. There was different wardrobe options for each, meaning sometimes like the male model, just kind of how it was built, would have shorter sleeves, or the females would have longer sleeves, and there were like slight differences between the same shirt across both that weren't necessarily design decisions from the get-go so much as just kind of being scrappy with the base art. The characters had kind of limited expressiveness. The eyes are kind of like I always thought that there was some charm to these avatars because they're kind of very like simple and cartoony and iconic, but the eyes are a little bit hard to read. They're kind of dead. You can't really tell where they're looking or if they're maintaining any sort of eye contact. The blinks are hard to read. The mouths are kind of hard to see. And even just the rigid bodies, like the simple shape doesn't yield a lot of sense of posture. It doesn't have that much of a sense of character. And there was some limited customization of these. So with the original avatar system, we didn't really have a sense of layering. It was just kind of, you had your hair slot, which could be a hair or a hat. If we wanted a hat, that was really just taking that piece and kind of forcing a certain hair or two on it. There was kind of one single whole body outfit that you could choose from. And one of the other avatar options that we had were actually robots. So we have these male, female, and more androgynous robot designs. And the customers we found actually appreciated the anonymity of being able to kind of duck a human form in VR. And another thing that we got out of user feedback was that they felt they could stand out more with these kind of like big silhouettes, that the difference between these robots is a little bit bolder than the difference between any two of the human characters you see. So when we kind of culled this feedback and we set out, the first thing that we did as a design team is, of course, we got customer feedback. We had town hall meetings with our program manager and some of our LT. We talked with customers in kind of one-to-many formats. And I, as a designer, like kind of sat in on a lot of these meetings just to see what people were saying when I first joined the team. We had a dialogue about what was important. We had surveys sent out to our users and our community staffers to get feedback on how to do this and what was important. We got feedback through our website, and we also culled some insights from Xbox avatar user research. Xbox had done a big avatar refresh in recent years. I have been on and off in my time at Microsoft kind of plugged into those discussions with our art directors. So there was good learnings there that we wanted to kind of build on and leverage when we were refactoring our own avatars. So based on all that feedback, we kind of set up some production goals for ourselves. And some of this was the design team formulating these goals, or LT kind of, top down giving us these goals. But one of the main goals was to create more appealing human avatars that would replace the robots, which was kind of a sensitive subject. A lot of users really liked the robots. The anonymity and the big silhouette and the personal brand was very useful. We demonstrated mixed reality principles for the org by trying to enhance human presence and make immersive expression for human avatars in VR. We wanted to improve our product diversity and inclusion. Diversity and inclusion is a core principle at Microsoft, but with avatars, we really, as a design team, it was involved in every conversation because we're literally trying to make a product that is trying to represent as many people as possible. And we want people to feel like there's something in there that they can express themselves with. We wanted to focus on customizing the silhouette, the colors, and the layering. As I mentioned before, the feedback that we got about these robot characters was that it allowed for a bigger visual impression from across a crowded room, which makes sense. I think when you think about character art and character design, you probably start with a silhouette, and that's kind of the first thing that people will read. So it made sense for us to try and make our avatars have bolder changes there. We also wanted to elevate the AltSpace brand identity. You know, we had done a lot of work with new environments and some of the big events that were in AltSpace to kind of plus our art, and the older character art was maybe just not quite in that same world. So it was important that these new avatars fit with that. And from a design standpoint, we also just wanted to make the best mobile capable VR avatar possible for big crowds. Our kind of lowest platform is the Oculus Quest in terms of performance. And we have events that can have 50, 70 plus people. So it was important that we land an avatar design that actually let us be as interesting and good looking as possible within the kind of technical constraints that we had. So to look at what some of those designs actually landed on, here's a picture of my avatar. It's maybe not as accurate now that I have actually gotten a haircut for the first time since I feel like quarantine started. But my avatar shows here some of the different choices we made in terms of body shape. So we kind of got rid of just having different base avatars and sort of there's one character base that can have all these body shapes and different face shapes, and every piece of clothing and every haircut and every customization works across the board for body shapes. That was one of the things that Xbox avatars, I think, had done that was well received, that we wanted to build on, is this idea of like not having such clear archetypes and having assets limited to that, but instead wanting people to make kind of choices to express themselves that way. It also shows a bit of the layering, so you can layer jackets over top of shirts, over top of pants, and you can have hairs and facial hairs and face features, and hairs will actually layer with any hat. So any hat can combine with any hair in a way that kind of makes sense. Some hairs, if you have like a really big giant hair, might just kind of like scrunch into the hat. But for the most part, we tried to preserve with every combinatorial choice users make, we wanted them to feel like their selections were being preserved and they could actually layer up and express some style, just like we can in the real world with our clothing choices. So in terms of how we kind of went about this process, the first thing that we did was a lot of prototyping. I'm a firm believer that all things should be prototyped if you have time for it. I think it's easy sometimes in meetings or in discussions to sort of index on what sounds like a good feature and what seems achievable. And I think it's easy when you're talking about features in a vacuum to really kind of like over-index on one thing or kind of gold plate something. And so for our avatars, prototyping was essential because we had to feel the art that we were proposing in VR. I mean, seen here is a pretty early version of our art in development. And some of the features, especially that were prototyped that landed, were this one is kind of simulated eye gaze, where our avatars try to maintain eye contact. The shader that became our Toon shader also allows for customization, and the body shape, kind of blend shape experience was prototyped early on as well, because we wanted to feel all those things in VR and really validate whether or not, one, these design choices were gonna feel good in product, and two, get a sense of whether or not they'd be possible. So in terms of our art pipeline for avatars, we had a lot of asset creation. So there's tons of geometry that we had to make. There's a lot of source textures that we had to make because for color customization, we had various versions. And then to ingest those, we have to go over to Unity and we have custom data formats and asset configurations to set up our library. Then we have a build where we can build asset bundles, which get deployed on the back end to our client. In terms of my focus as a tech artist on the team, I really focus on this core user loop for our artists of creating assets and ingesting assets in Unity. So building the geometry, all the tools to make sure that process went well, setting up a substance painter pipeline that was going to work well to generate all the variations we needed, and then asset ingestion, where we actually had to set everything up in Unity and preview kind of the end result. So I either wrote tools or worked with engineering to design tools that would empower artists to work efficiently in this core area. Those tools began with a set of Maya tools. So Maya is our DCC of choice with the AltSpace Studio. That's what our character artists were most familiar with. There's a little bit of ZBrush to kind of supplement it as needed, but Maya is really kind of where things start going into the funnel of our pipeline. I was able to write Python-based and PyML tools that actually plugged into a architecture that was being built by another tech artist at Microsoft, which allowed for GDPR compliant telemetry. So we're able to log event usage for all of our tools that are compliant with like user privacy laws and things like that. So it's actually the sort of anonymous event usage. But for me, I just basically got, here's the number of times a given tool or a given script was actually used in production over the course of time. So because this was telemetry enabled, we were able to actually calculate time saved. And the types of tasks that were automated were asset referencing, things like maintaining and updating our base character reference that had to go into kind of every wardrobe piece, file export. So based on the source structure of our Maya working directory, if you hit a button to export like one or two different types of variations of a wardrobe piece, it would automatically go to the right place on the Unity side with correct folder names and correct file names. Skinning, because we kind of implemented some custom GPU skinning for certain things. We had to make sure that wardrobe assets were actually bound to the right joints that could get picked up later. And also just in terms of like a character skinning, the skinning tools would bind to certain selected sets of joints and copy skin weights from the body so that artists could kind of get like a really good one-click base. And then there might be, usually in the collars of the characters, there might be a couple verts that kind of went astray, but it became pretty automatic. And especially because we are kind of a VR app where we're not showing limbs at the moment, it does make that a bit easier to get around the problem area of the shoulders, but it was a really quick solution for our artists. But the biggest tool that was used was actually one that matches blend shape. So because we have all these body types, our base character has a blend shape, and that's a tool that's seen here. But we could very quickly wrap our new piece of wardrobe to the blend targets that are on the base body. It would generate all the meshes that were needed based on what the base body was equipped with. It would name those correctly. It would reconnect blend shapes if you wanted to the piece of wardrobe that was going out, and it would just set that up, usually in one click. It wasn't always 100%. Sometimes the artist would still kind of have to go in and fix maybe one or two pieces that got squashed or stretched too much, but it was a lot faster than doing it by hand. So all of these tasks can take 30 seconds to 5 minutes or maybe 10 minutes at a time, depending on how fast your artist is. But because we had that telemetry, I was able to see that over the course of production, some of these tools, even as simple as they are, get used hundreds or thousands of times. And it saved over 150 hours of production. So if there's one thing I can impress on everyone today, it's the surprising amount of time that I think, when I look back early in my career, the studios I worked on that were heavily pipeline, I don't even think I knew how to export an FBX correctly and look out for scene scaling and all that stuff then, because it was hidden from me. And when you're actually able to quantify how much time you can save by just taking that repetitive step out of artists' hands, you eliminate a lot of work, and you also eliminate human error of having typos or having to find the folder and create something that maybe the name doesn't match. So it's really good for organization. It's really good to help save time. I also developed the Toon shader that's in our avatars. The GPU skinning portion of it was kind of developed by another engineer, but as far as the look dev, I had a lot of input from the character artists on the team, but I developed a Toon shader that fits our product aesthetic. So we kind of landed on this cartoon style. It's very, it's kind of like a timeless sort of thing. We identified a lot of games that have this Toon style that still hold up. And for us running on mobile VR, it was a good way to have something that's like stylized and stays well clear of the uncanny valley and allows people to just kind of have fun with it rather than getting too into the detailed nuance of like trying to shade realistic skin in VR, especially on mobile. So it fits our technical constraints well. The shader actually handles compositing the face textures together. So things like eyebrows, eyes, the iris texture that we have, user eye color, eyeshadow color, lipstick color. All these inputs are handled by the shader and user tintable based on the texture inputs. And the shader actually has kind of a PBR-like effect to it. So we did work in Substance Painter, and we wanted to kind of emulate that material definition that we had there in terms of ambient occlusion, metalness, roughness, and then rim highlight is kind of like our glossiness, or kind of like our reflection strength. And it allowed us to paint masks that kind of get some sense of like the hair has sort of the striations of an anisotropic highlight without really having that same exact shader math. The metal on the jacket still has a sense of shine. The glasses can kind of have these like painterly sort of reflective streaks. And it's all done kind of in one pass. It doesn't have multiple draw calls needed. It doesn't use post-processing like a lot of contemporary, Breath of the Wild style Toon shading might, because we didn't have that option on mobile VR. To support working with that, I helped our artists with Substance Painter. So a lot of our artists had maybe not used Substance Painter in a full production before this project. I honestly hadn't even used it in a full production before this project, because when I was a production artist, Substance Painter hadn't really hit the scene yet. But I'd kept up on it, and I knew that if we wanted to be able to reuse things like kind of material setups and create kind of this predictable, scalable library, Substance Painter was going to be kind of an essential tool for us. So to support that, I ported our Avatar Toon shader to Substance Painter. I did this kind of a little later in production once I finally had time, but it's something that continues to be useful for artists today as we continue to put out assets with our library. And porting that just allowed our artists to kind of preview the Toon shading. They could paint their AO metal roughness channels right in Substance and get a preview of how that shading was going to work, how that kind of rim light was going to work out. Another important thing was setting up Substance Painter and custom shelves. So if you're using Substance Painter, it was really helpful for us to make template files that set the channels that were expected to be used. If you're using channels that have any custom outputs that are shader dependent, it helps to create those template files that artists can just sort of like load that template, have everything set up, have their bake texture settings all set, and have their export set. So by creating those templates and sharing them with a shelf, everyone was kind of able to just start working and not worry about those things from one asset to another. Another thing that I did was I used Substance Designer to create some Substance Painter filters that would allow artists to actually preview the masks and the color tinting as the users would see it. So the way a lot of our clothing customization works is when we wanted to enhance the user color customization, we didn't want to just tint the whole thing with a single albedo color like we had maybe done previously. We actually wanted to have these different mask textures that allow the plaid shirt to have like multiple detailed colors of the plaid rather than just be like, here's a red tinted plaid. So to do that, our artists within Substance Painter were kind of painting with like a channel that was our pattern layer, and they had to kind of paint in red, blue, and green, thinking of each one as a mask, which is pretty unintuitive. If you look the bottom left-hand corner, there's kind of this plaid shirt where everything's like, RGB, it's like very dev colors. But by putting this filter on the top of the stack, it allowed artists to put in the kind of color customizations that they wanted to make and paint these channels, seeing that live and play around with the colors and make sure that it would work with different color configs. So that plaid shirt that we see there in the pattern swatch is kind of that like light blue and red and white with still neon green buttons just to preserve some dev art in that thumbnail. But it was an ability for users or for artists to see what this was going to result in and play around with the colors without leaving Substance Painter. Because even though Substance, the Unity export's pretty fast, as long as we can keep artists working within one stage of the pipeline and seeing kind of like, if you can be in one stage of the pipeline and see the furthest ahead possible in the pipeline to get your result and have confidence that you're not going to have to kind of go back, re-export and redo, it just helps people to kind of like stay in flow, stay in the zone, and not worry about the loop back and forth between applications. Another thing that was important for our artists was having a more scalable library. So in terms of our wardrobe, we wanted to do things that would make it easier to work with. One of the big ones is I worked with our engineers to design a system where we actually generate the final mesh and texture at runtime, which means we can re-atlas our wardrobe UVs. What this allows us to do is, like in previous versions of our character library and in a lot of kind of character customization games I've seen, your avatar has kind of a master UV layout where it's like bodies over here, faces here, You know, hats is in one area. And then if you change what you want to offer players in the future, you kind of have to go back and rebake. AltSpace previously had experiences where we had to expanded the different choices a user had, which meant we had to go back and rebake all our textures. And as we added more masks and more complexity, automating that became harder. And as artists, it just wasn't a step that we wanted to do. We wanted artists to be able to focus on make a piece as optimized as you can with your UV space, and then not worry about it. And the nice thing about this is it allows us as either tech artists or engineers to kind of have dynamic texel density over each piece parametrically. So we can choose just using Unity's kind of texture compression settings to give the hair or the face or the upper body higher texel density than, say, the pants, because in a VR application, when you're kind of talking face to face, the expectation is not that you're going to be like, you know, looking at someone's shoes or something like that. And for artists, that allows us to kind of, like, as I said, scale the wardrobe without ever having to touch old textures. The other thing that we did that was helpful was we used a lot of Unity scriptable objects to organize our avatar catalog so that within a given avatar item, you could define, like, here is my shirt, here are the different geo variations it can have, here are the different texture variations it can have, and it lives in one place. So as an artist working in this project, you can kind of worry about one asset. And then when you're done with it, there's a list somewhere of tops, for example, that you need to add that shirt to, but you kind of just need to update those two files. Whereas previously, and in some other projects I've worked on, there maybe be a master prefab that's like, here's the library of options you can have. And the problem with that is it lives in one place, which means there's kind of this master file. Everyone has to edit it. It creates a lot of merge conflicts. It centralizes the data in a weird spot that's hard for an artist to sort of link back to the art. So we kind of decentralized our library and made it a little bit less error prone and a little more self-contained if you're an artist, to be able to just see all the assets that are relevant to this piece you're working on live in one folder, and it's a little bit more manageable from like a human readability standpoint to deal with that. One of the final pieces that we also did, which helped our art team quite a lot, and again, I did not write the code for this, wonderful engineer named David Calabrese, and our other engineer, Nate Thorne, were kind of responsible for a lot of our tooling on the Unity side, but I would work with them to sort of spec or design how it would work. But we wrote a tool that helped us batch thumbnail generation. You know, it's something that I don't know people really thought about being a hurdle in the process, but previously in AltSpace menus, like before I joined the team, there were some big avatar reworks that kind of had new menu constraints and new thumbnails had to be generated. And there were some Maya side tools to do this, but the problem there is that you kind of get a Maya diffuse view of the asset where you can merge your shader or port your shader back to Maya to try and generate those thumbs, but you still have a result of getting a bunch of thumbnails updated, copying them over, our artists were copying them over to Unity and then having to go reconnect all of them. And it was still a really time-consuming process. You know, I was told when I joined the team that the last iteration of this had taken days, if not like a week, just to kind of get all the thumbnails tightened up for the menu. So one of the highest impact things that our engineers did for us was building this batch thumbnail system, which within our editor tools, while kind of working with an avatar, we had some prefabs that were different camera setups and different cameras for different catalog parts, and you can have override cameras. It was very customizable, but you would have different cameras that you could, as an artist, just animate, like move around the avatar to get a good framing for a given piece of the catalog, and then you could batch it. So in one click, you could either regenerate the entire wardrobe library of thumbnails, you could regenerate a single category like hats, you could regenerate all the thumbnails for a single item. So if we had an item that had maybe some variations, you could just do those, or you could just piecemeal do a single thumbnail. So for hairs, for example, we may find that if we picked kind of one generic thumbnail, some of our hairs are extending high and they're like really big, and some of them are really long. So maybe we would want to reframe our thumbnail camera for each one of those to make sure that we're capturing what that hair is. And having a tool like this that batched the generation as well as immediately hooked it up to the item, because that was another step that artists had to do before, is actually connecting that data. It saved an immeasurable amount of time, and more importantly, like, not only did it make that task easier, but it made it repeatable. So we were no longer kind of going through this monstrous library trying to generate screenshots. We had a really fast tool to do it, and the result there is that you can play around with your framing. You can make sure that every different thumbnail type actually shows off that asset well. And because it was customizable enough, different things like eyes even were kind of like zoomed in on just showing like a single eye design, whereas maybe some of our previous thumbnails were just like pulled out showing the whole face, which in a relatively small thumbnail is hard to appreciate. So with kind of all these tools and workflows in a limited set of time, our art team, which was, I think, fewer than 10 artists at the peak of production, and in maybe a pretty short production, shipped an asset catalog of, I think, over 300, I forget the exact number, but like well over 300 assets. And when we talk about our asset catalog, we talk about the base geometry as well as variants, which can be different geo variants or different texture variants. So there's 46 hairs, 14 facial hairs, 17 jackets, 19 hats, 12 pants, glasses, and some different facial features. And this number is still growing. I think just last week, more were released for hairs, and I think the month before that, more were released. So I'm not sure if this number count is even valid anymore. So I want to take a moment to kind of recap a little bit and maybe get a little bit soapboxy and just talk about kind of like what I've learned and what maybe my workflow or work philosophy is as a result of all these experience. I've been a generalist who's had the pleasure and privilege of working across a number of different product areas. And I think working in very different things, from previs to product design on HoloLens to UI and UX to something that is game-like in AltSpace, I've kind of learned a lot of different lessons and a lot of things that I think apply to what we're all doing, which is iteration is the key to good product. No matter if it's an artist cranking again and again on trying to get a sculpt perfectly, or if it's a designer trying to work a UI flow to be as efficient and as user-centric as it can be. None of us usually gets things right on the first try, and the more you can allow people to spend their iteration time on the things that matter, the better off they're going to be, because an artist doesn't want to struggle with pipeline, an artist wants to make good art, and then the product's going to be better because you're putting people's best talents on the things that they're best served doing. As far as tech art specifically or engineering, I would automate the little things before they add up. Like if you look at some of those tools I talked about with AltSpace, there's nothing groundbreaking there. There's not like an amazing content management tool, but it's just a bunch of little stuff that happens thousands or hundreds of times on a production. And that scales with the number of people you have. And that work has an impact, I think, faster than we realize. In terms of being an artist in this space, I think we're living in a world where things move more and more procedural. And I don't think art has to be fully procedural, but if you're an artist trying to think about how to be efficient, try to be organized, think about being scalable, think about being reusable. If you're an artist who's like crafting something and the process to get it done is surprisingly painful, then like maybe think about how you can just like, work that workflow to be a little better and a little more reusable. Always focus on the end user or the customer, which can be, in the case of AltSpace, that's the people using the product, that's the people actually on the other side. But in the case of pipeline tools, that's the artist on your team. I think it's very easy sometimes, if you're more engineering brain, to say, I've identified how this tool works. I have made it work the way I thought. It should be great. And then when users come to us and they say, hey, this is not how I expected it to work, like just remember that you're setting them up for success. Or if it's a customer or a player, like you're setting them up to have fun. So don't be precious about your solution, which also leads into kind of this idea of just trusting people and working together. I think as I've gone on in my career and I look back at successes and failures in everything I've done in this industry, the thing that always comes up the most is just remembering that, like, we're all in this together. We're making products that people want to enjoy. We're working with people, and people at the end of the day are what we're going to kind of remember and appreciate about projects past. And when people, like if an artist tells you that they're struggling with a workflow or a tool, or if a gamer who's playing your game tells you that something is not working for them or something's not inclusive or not accessible, like trust the stories that people are bringing to you, and just be willing to work together on that. And I think we can listen to people's stories, and it makes all of our products better when we kind of empower everybody with them. So thank you. That's all I have prepared. Happy to move into some Q&A. And if anyone wants to connect on LinkedIn, I'll just leave this up here. linkedin.com/in/Kevin J. Appel, or ask Robert Lloyd. He has my info, so he can put us in contact.
Awesome. Thank you again so much, Kevin. All right. So for those who haven't seen it, we do have the Q&A button down at the bottom. So if you have questions, please start writing them there. And that one actually is from Rob. So we'll start with that. So Rob asks in the chat, because that's what he has to use. How big is AltSpace VR team? How big is the team at AltSpace VR on the tech side? You mentioned the art asset side maxed at around 10.
Yeah, so on the tech side, people work in different areas of products, so it's hard to say. I want to say engineering resources probably around 30.
Around 30. Okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, I think one thing that may be surprising to folks who hear like Microsoft is that within Microsoft there are different orgs and different teams and different products that all range in scale. And it's I don't know how much I'm allowed to say about these things, but I'll just say like sometimes it's surprising how much kind of big work happens within such a large company by a small number of people.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, definitely. And I know a couple people who've been in and out of Microsoft through the time to know that. Yeah, absolutely. Question from Colin in what is a geo variant?
Yeah, so within our asset library, we think of geo variants as things like for our hairs, for example, there's the hair without a hat and hair with a hat. There's also some things like one of our ponytails has another variant where if you have a baseball cap on, the hair can actually like stick out of the loop in the back. Open and closed jackets, things like this. It's just our shorthand for like variations on the geometry of an asset, whereas texture variants are variations on just the textures, things like patterns and stuff like that.
Cool. All right. While I'll go with Rob. What is the threshold that you look for before deciding to make a custom tool or automate a process?
That's a good question. I've had the luxury of being on teams where I'm kind of helping figure out the workflow in the first place. And for me, it's a bit of a gut feeling where if as an artist, I'm finding myself doing steps to get a piece done where I'm like, this is going to be horrible to go back and redo, or I'm not going to be able to do it the same way. That's a good candidate. I want to probably script that. Or if it's just really repetitive and mindless, things like file export, things like asset referencing. If you can just make it so that people don't have to worry about that or get caught in like things that are error prone, like even something as simple as exporting file to the right folder with the right like structure of folder names. You know, people have typos, some people are faster or slower typists. So things like that are good candidates, just like get them out of the way. If it's my gut instinct is always like, if I don't want to do it again, then I'll probably try to write a script and not have to do it again.
Which is always good. So to get started in tech art, what programming languages would you focus on, at least to start? That comes from Steven.
Great question. Definitely Python. For a lot of the pipeline tools I've worked in professionally on the Maya side, at least at Microsoft, things have moved really Python heavy in the last, 6 years in my experience. I'm sure it's probably been longer at other studios. All of the tools for DCC pipeline that I wrote for AltSpace were Python using PyMel. The framework that I alluded to that was kind of like, it's sort of like this open source internal project where our pipeline tools are actually DCC agnostic. So I wrote scripts that were for Maya, but some of those modules kind of went elsewhere so that they can be used by Houdini or Max or whatever. So Python's super handy. If you're interested in machine learning, that's also going to be really well used there. And C#. I think Unity is a great game engine to kind of dive in and just play around with. It makes it fairly accessible if you want to get into things like shaders or scripting, and C# is helpful. For shaders, I write HLSL at this point, but if you are a visual learner like me, for years I was mostly using node-based editors. So, in Unity, Amplify Shader, I think it's Amplify Shader Editor now. Shader Forge is dead, but that's what I originally used. Those are great tools as well that I'd recommend just diving into.
Cool. Actually, so I'll use that to segue into one of the questions that I wrote, which is that because you mentioned Substance Painter a little bit earlier on that wasn't a thing at first when you started, and now it is. So from your perspective, what are some upcoming tools you think are going to be a big part of your job in the future? Or alternatively, what tools do you wish you had? Because I know you think a lot about like automating these processes and making them easier. What tools do you wish you had?
Yeah. So I mean, I think Substance Painter is a big one because it allows you to start being a little bit procedural, but not fully. Like I wish Substance Painter had more of a procedural stack in the same way that Houdini might. I wish Photoshop had some of the concepts of Substance Painter. You know, that ability to sort of like have anchor points and reuse. I think I said earlier that like things don't need to be fully procedural, but I think workflows are trending towards we always want to do more with less, resource wise. And so I think the industry is trending towards more tools that are either more procedural or more machine learning focused. For example, Substance Designer in the last Substance Days keynote kind of put out this preview of taking a photo of a material, a single flash photo, and then it finding procedural material graphs that closely matched and generating a plausible result in a way that lets the artist still dive in and mess with that to like tweak it. So I personally think, that type of machine learning where it is automatically generated, but there's enough input into the black box for artists to still have an impact. If you look at Weta Digital, I think a lot of their kind of like face cap driven character animation for like Thanos and stuff like that is similar, where machine learning is helping get the pose, but artists have more input. I think, it helps to have an understanding of procedural art because I do think certain tools are moving towards using those types of tools to get to 80%. And I think there's still room for artists to pick up from there and do the remaining 20%, but it seems to me to be trending more that way.
Cool, makes sense. So more I was thinking that tech art is considered one of those jobs that a lot of folks who are considering games they don't really even think about it. Like when you're first kind of getting into it, that a lot of people don't realize it's a job or know that it exists. This is definitely true with some of my students at other schools. Drexel is kind of being a tech-driven school knows, but like some of the art schools I teach at, students don't even know that tech art is a thing. So my question is kind of multifaceted. So you said you started with doing models and rigging. Did you come into the industry knowing you wanted to be a tech artist, or did you kind of get led into that direction? And how would you describe your job to someone who's kind of on the outside?
Yeah. So I don't think I mentioned at the beginning, I did go to Drexel, so I'm a Drexel grad, but to be honest, no, I don't think I realized that tech artist was a thing. I think I knew that a TD was a thing, character rigging and that type of pipeline, but it didn't occur to me that, and we did a little bit of shader work. Like I was in the grad program and Chris Redman, of course, taught a shader writing class, but it didn't occur to me that that could be this whole career path within games or even within tech. And I think some of that has just changed in recent years with AR and VR, and more tech companies are wanting Unity people who can do this stuff. So I think that changes the game a little bit. So I don't think I realized it. I think it's been kind of almost an accidental discovery, where, as I mentioned, like early in my career, I was an artist, but I happen to know how to script. And really, I joke all the time that I just wanted to be lazy. I didn't want to do the stuff I didn't want to do. And so I would script things to get out of my way. And what has been the driver for me is being on a lot of small teams with big ambitions, where someone had to just learn to speed things up or do something new, and that might as well be me. So I think it was a bit of an accidental discovery for me, and to some extent, like I wish I knew what I was doing sooner, to be honest with you. And in terms of how I describe myself to others, most often in my career, I am the person who is helping art and design achieve what they want within the constraints and with the engineering requirements that we have. Both in AltSpace and in HoloLens, I am the person who's taking this like aspirational design that artists or designers have and saying, well, we can't exactly do that because runtime performance is a thing, but here's some creative problem solving that I can do to get the idea across. And that's ultimately what I think it comes down to. It's just solving those creative problems to help people get what they want to get out of it.
Very cool. So Rob asked in our Q&A, I'm going to use the second one there because I think it leads off of that question very good. Is there anything you wish you had learned in school to better prepare yourself for a tech art role?
I wish I understood the data behind 3D art a little better. And I it's fuzzy memory now. I think I graduated in '09. So, maybe this is just me being old and not remembering my lessons very well. But I wish that I had better understood the properties of 3D art. A model has vertices and all the data that they can contain and how that can inform the pipeline, right? Like so much of what I do is just like encoding into vertex data stuff that I'm going to write into a shader to do something fun. And I think even when I was a 3D artist, like I knew shamefully little about how like normal maps actually worked. And I don't know if that was just me in school just wanting to be like, I just want to model and not pay attention to this side of stuff, or if it was just like that side of tech art wasn't fully part of the curriculum. But if I have any advice to people who, even if you consider yourself like more full artists, like try to understand how this stuff moves through a little bit of the graphics pipeline, just because it will unlock, for me anyway, it unlocked capabilities I didn't know I had when I started actually exploring this thing and thinking about my art as a little bit more data. Because instead of being like, I don't know how to make a material that can make this thing animate cool, and because of performance, someone's telling me no, instead I'm just like, cool, let me figure out how to work with these constraints to make this thing I want. So yeah.
I think it's funny because I have a lot of my students in one of my classes that just today and last week I have been talking about shaders, and I'm not a tech artist, but I have been saying, hey, there's vertex shaders and fragment shaders, and this is how they work and this is how they talk together. And it's really funny that you just kind of touched on a lot of the things that we've been talking about in that class. So I thought that was really
And
funny.
it's funny too, because I mean, I've worked with people who are like industry professionals who don't understand the difference between a material and a shader, and like that's fine if you don't interface at that level. But if you want to get into especially real-time graphics, you are going to be more empowered as an individual to do more if you are open to thinking about those things and learning those tech challenges. Like I know a lot of artists who are just like, oh, I'm just not technical, I don't want to think about it. But you can do a lot more if you're open to that thinking. And if you, I think one of the key things in this industry is just to like always be learning more, unless you just want to like do nothing but ZBrush for 10,000 hours, which is great if it's a single calling. But in terms of like not to sound like a square, but like in terms of career and ability to kind of like get and maintain jobs and all that stuff, like being flexible and robust in your ability is a huge boon. When I went to Drexel, it was before you could specialize in different areas. And so we did everything. Like we did digital photography, shooting and lighting, sound design. Like we did everything when I was there. And I think I remember talking to like Glenn Muschio at the time, and I was just like, man, can I just do 3D? And I have used all of those other skills in my career. They've all come in handy. So, I'm not saying everyone has to be a generalist, and there's still the whole like jack of all trades thing, but it has made me flexible in my career. It's opened up opportunities I wouldn't have had. And I am inspired by that to then just keep learning, because it unblocks me to do more. And then the nice thing is it also unlocks maybe more job stability type stuff in this industry.
Absolutely. Cool. So going back to the Q&A, Rob asked also, is there anything you wish you had learned to school that better prepared you for, wait, that's the one we asked. I think I hit answer on the wrong one. Hold on one second. Here we go. Have you seen a job description go away because tools automate that role now?
I don't think so yet. There are some advances recently, like MetaHumans, you see in the new, the Unreal character thing, which is interesting because like to a small studio, maybe that means you don't need a character artist if you want to do exactly what they're giving you. To a larger studio, I think that still just gets you partway there. There's another project called Promethean AI, which is from a former tech art lead at Naughty Dog, which is I find fascinating because it's using machine learning to say like, generate me an 80s kid's bedroom, and it will build a level that kind of matches that description based on your voice input, given a library of assets. And that's like a proof of concept product. Like I don't know how close that is to market. And their whole pitch is, the artist behind it, I think even answers in some of his video presentations on the product that like his goal is not to replace level designers' jobs, it's to get them to the point where they're at 80%, they can focus on the nuance. So in my experience, I don't think I've seen CG jobs or industry jobs completely go away. I think they have transformed to maybe using tools and leveraging things like megascans. Like I think there's more of a willingness to leverage tools that get you part of the way, so that artists can just focus on that like last 20% of polish or that thing that's different about the experience. But I don't think I've seen things disappear. But I do think a challenge for me and for other artists is like, for some of these projects that are maybe photoreal focused or like trying to make really huge things are moving more procedural. And so this like being willing to be less precious maybe about the aesthetic and be more willing to like use what you can. Like, I think depending on the team and the job and where you're at, some productions are surprisingly scrappy where they're like, buy it on TurboSquid, don't care, you know? So I think one of the lessons there is like, you know, sometimes as artists, we maybe have to learn to be less precious and just like use what we have to then just put the polish on top instead of like everything comes from scratch.
Kind of reminds me of mocap too, because I think mocap was like one of the earlier ones where a lot of people were afraid that was going to replace all animation and all animation jobs. But
yeah,
to this day, mocap still needs a lot of cleanup.
Yeah, it still needs cleanup, and it's still not used everywhere, right? Like I think Pixar and their big productions anyway famously still doesn't want to use it because they're about that craft. So, you know, I think there will always be this holdouts. Like I might be wrong on this, but last I checked, Naughty Dog's character team still preferred sculpting everything to using scans. I think they maybe don't do that 100% of the time. But last I checked, they were still like, no, our character art team sculpts everything because we don't want to just scan. But scans get you 80% of the way there if you don't have time. So, you know,
right.
There's still art jobs to clean it up and then put your art touch on it, but it may not be do everything from scratch.
And lastly, and I don't know if this is a serious question, but I'll read it anyway from Rob in the chat. Have you embedded anything unexpected or odd in UV channel data to use for a shader?
I don't know how unexpected or odd it is. I once made a material that like we didn't have blend shapes working in the engine we're using, so I had a material where I was basically just making blend shapes work via the shader. So I stored in vertex data, you know, for any given blend shape, what the delta was between the two verts and the magnitude in my RGBA, and then I was able to drive basically shader-driven blend shapes through that because we just didn't have blend shapes. I once did a thing where I had like a school of fish where I kind of made a mesh, or I made like copies of the mesh, and in Maya I scripted something that just like scattered them in a school shape, and I embedded like their individual offset as well as like some arbitrary number offset for timeline on the animation into each copy, and I put them all back, and then the shader was able to like procedurally do sine waves for them all swimming and bobbing, scaling the scattering, and like all of their, you know, the sine wave for them doing this. So it was like a shader version of what you might do in particles because I just didn't want to touch the CPU. A lot of my work over the years has been like do it on the GPU because the CPU is busy. So a lot of my like mangling things into vertex data or UV data is usually about that.
Cool. Well, and question from Quinn's coming. Has working in tech art made learning other platforms and engines easier? And have you ever helped creating an engine?
I guess technically I have with the latter point. Working as I've gone down this path of being more tech art oriented has absolutely made learning easier because I think the thing that I left best equipped for from Drexel honestly was like being a self-starter and being able to learn, which then makes one getting into tech art easier. It kind of fuels my curiosity within tech art. Like if I don't understand something, I usually have this fire like I need to understand it now because I hate not feeling like I can do stuff. So it's made learning tools easier. Like my whole career at this point has been learning tools. You know, nothing about how I would make an asset when I started my career is the same now. Like I wouldn't sit down the model from scratch in Maya. I wouldn't do all the texturing in Photoshop. So learning tools is always a constant. And have I ever helped create an engine? Not entirely, but the proprietary engines that we worked on in oloLens were like, you can think of it as a train's going down the track and you're laying the track one step ahead of the train. So I didn't code any of that stuff, but in terms of like feature requests and testing, onboarding features and helping that engine get built, I was definitely involved in that.
Cool. And I concur with what Quinn's followed up in the chat with, saying that sounds very stressful.
Yes, it can be very stressful, but it can also be fun. So, you know, throughout some of that proprietary engine work was interesting because that blend shape example, like I've worked in tools where like, oh, I want to make a thing go from this to this, use blend shape, but there's no blend shapes. And one of the crazier examples I did was I only showed a still of it earlier, but I think I have it on my portfolio website. But for the HoloLens 1 announce, I made this little beach diorama that was originally supposed to be just testing our first LOD system. We implemented LODs. It was a test to see what the most complicated thing we could use for an LOD was. And it wound up going on stage at one of our keynotes. And the funny thing was about that is it's this little cylinder with like a little ocean diorama. And there's like a turtle swimming in there and some seaweed bobbing. And the waves kind of just do like a little sine wave thing with like a texture scroll. Because we didn't have vertex shaders, we didn't have blend shapes. So there was no way I could make like the wave sign like I would normally do. I also wasn't very good at shaders at that time. So I don't know if I would have been good at that anyway. So what I did was in Maya, I ran a bunch of like sine deformers across the surface, and I wrote scripts that put joints on all those surfaces, constrain them to that surface, bake the animation to the joints, and then I skinned the thing. So the asset has like this crazy number of joints all over it, and then it worked. And it's like this horribly inefficient solution if you compare it against whatever else you might be able to do. But given the tools that we had, it ran. It succeeded at getting the idea across. So it's this like totally weird solution to something that you take for granted. So working in emerging engines is totally stressful, but it's also kind of fun because it's, in a way, it makes me feel, I imagine it feels how like early pioneers of VFX and gaming must have felt, like when they were figuring all this stuff out for the first time. And working in AR and VR, like the Oculus Quest is like PS2 era hardware. So in a way, a lot of this creative problem solving and like engines that are missing features, it's like using Unity 10 years ago or using hardware 10 or 20 years ago, where it's like being a pioneer all over again. And I'm sure I'm just like rediscovering old stuff from like, you know, NVIDIA's GPU gems written 20 years ago. But there's something fun about like going back and kind of, it's like home movies or something where you're kind of like, oh, let me relearn or rediscover this technique.
Awesome. All right. Do we have any other questions up here from Jason? Do you have any recommendations for online resources where people can learn more about tech art and the tech components of 3D art, whether it's shaders, scripting, map types, 3D geometry attributes, etc.?
Yeah, there's a couple books that I've read over the years that I recommend. GPU Gems is like an old NVIDIA book. I think it's called like Unity Shader Cookbook or Unity Cookbook, which is kind of co-authored by a couple of folks who have blogs. There's someone named Alan Zucconi who has a website that's really good that does a lot of tutorials that are usually tech art and shader focused. There's another tech artist on Twitter named, I think like Harry Salvakis or something like that. I'm probably butchering it, but that Twitter's a good follow. Cat Like Coding, the website Cat Like Coding is amazing. They have tons of tutorials that will help with shaders and like the Unity rendering stack. A lot of these things are Unity focused because that's kind of what I've delved into the most, but all of those resources and all of those artists are amazing to follow. Shader Lab, the Shader Lab website, it can be a little crazy to dive in as like a fresh start, but that's really good. There's also, I think it's the Book of Shaders is a website where it's a graphics programmer who has kind of chapter by chapter shader concepts that are interactive, similar to Shader Lab. Yeah, I think that's some of the stuff that I always find myself coming back to. I also spend a lot of time on Reddit, kind of scoping out like the Unity and Unreal Reddits, just because people post interesting stuff and tutorials, and I always find it fascinating just to see what problems other people out there are solving. And like sometimes you'll see, you know, an ocean shader on there like every couple of weeks, which is a little similar. But sometimes you'll see really creative stuff people are doing, and sometimes I'll even hop on there and ask people, just I'm curious. I'm like, hey, what's going on here? Did you do this? And a lot of the indie devs there are like, yeah, I did this. I'm like, that's very clever. Like it's fun just to see what people are working on.
Absolutely. All right. Any final questions? Anything else we got? Keep an eye on chat in case Rob has anything.
No, I think I've exhausted the ones that I want to bug him with. Though I think I might follow up with you, Kevin, and double check the list of some of the assets that you just talked about, and we can add that into the notes on the YouTube video and share that with people, because I think that's a great little list of assets and pointers that you just rattled off. So good stuff.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, definitely. All right, then I think we are good if there are no other questions. So thank you again so much, Kevin. Really, really appreciate you being here, and also a lot of really great information. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks again for having me. Thanks for being here to listen to what I have to say. And as I mentioned, if anyone wants to connect, if ever I can help out, I would not be here if not for the mentors and help I've had along the way in my career. And if there's ever anything I can do to help anyone else out, I am always willing to help out. So feel free to get in touch. Ask Rob, ask Adrian. If you have their contact and not mine, drop me a line. If I can ever be of use, then I'm happy to.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, and get words of appreciation in the chat. Awesome. Thank you, and thank you all for being here. Thank you for making this a success as always. Remember, if there are things that you missed, we will have this up on our YouTube page soonish, so be sure to check out for that. And yeah, keep an eye out. Our next meeting is going to be on, just make sure I get the correct date. Is going to be April 13th. We'll have more information about what that is soon. So thank you all again so much, and everybody have a good rest of your night. Take care.
Thank you. Take care.